So we'll go ahead and start with the first presentation, which will be from Gail Boucher, who, as she mentioned, is a Home Access Program Coordinator for Direct Center for Independence. And she's also certified, has certification from the American Society of Interior Designers.
When Martha contacted me and said that she'd like me to present today, I said, well, you know, we do home modifications primarily on owner-occupied housing. And so then it was like, well, over the years, we've done a lot of work at Direct in the area of fair housing advocacy. And so when I started to look at what we do and how it kind of overlaps with fair housing, I said, yes, I'd really like to participate. So what I've put together for you is a presentation on looking at some of the fundamental design guidelines that are used in fair housing, but how they're used today and how they were developed so we can have a better understanding of where we're going. So the Fair Housing Act, again, was 47 years ago. The next slide, thank you. Oh, no, back. Sorry. Okay, anyhow, the Fair Housing Act is 47 years old, and what we call the ANSI guidelines are about the same age. ANSI stands for the American National Standards Institute, which the American National Standards Institute is actually a testing development portion of the government. And they are funded to test everything from commercial products, industrial products, residential products. You can look on your hot water heater and see a listing of the ANSI standards that were done to test these products. Well, back in the late 1960s, early 70s, the government said, well, how do we come up with these guidelines? So they approached ANSI and said, we want you to develop the guidelines, which they did. And the underlying foundation for what we use today in ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, the International Building Codes, and countless other codes come from the ANSI guidelines. And so ANSI 117.1 is the foundation for all of the accessible design elements that we use today in America. My concern, and the reason I wanted to talk to you today, is the fact that these guidelines are over 40 years old. And what we've seen is there's been a gradual change in the disability population. When these guidelines were first developed, there was a lot of civil rights movement about getting people out into the public. Well, people are now out and more visible, but what we're seeing is there are changes in the disability population. Okay. Today in Arizona, from the 2012 census, Cornell University put together a sort of a synopsis of how many people, state by state, were individuals with disabilities. And in Arizona, we had approximately 11.7% of the population that identified as having a disability. And the disability could be anything from a visual impairment, hearing impairment, cognitive issues, mental health issues, and as well physical disabilities. And out of that population, about 756,000 were individuals with disabilities out of a total population of about 6,462,000 individuals in Arizona. Out of the group, those 75 and older were the largest that reported having issues with disability. But however, I'll tell you, from working with this population for years, they'll tell you they don't have a disability, they're just getting old. So, and they account for about 46% of the disability population in Arizona. Among all the groups that were reported, the most common disabling condition was issues surrounding ambulatory movement in the built environment, which is exactly what we do, and which is one of the big elements that you see in fair housing. Okay. At Direct, what we've seen over the years has been a gradual change in the disability population. When I first started there about 20 years ago, we were seeing a lot of folks that were dealing with post-polio, which is a carryover from the polio epidemic of the 50s. We were also seeing people with MS, a lot of folks with spinal cord injuries. But now today, we're seeing a gradual trend and a transition away from some of those long-standing disabilities. We're seeing an increase in referrals for folks with diabetes. We've always had diabetes, but it is now becoming probably 2/3 of our referrals are individuals who identify as having some form of diabetes. We also are seeing a very significant increase in obesity, although I understand obesity is not covered as a covered disability under the Fair Housing Act. It is covered, however, under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The other thing that we're seeing is arthritis. Although arthritis has always been a concern, we're seeing an increased prevalence there. I believe part of that, too, is a lot of folks with arthritis come to Arizona for their health. And so we're seeing a very significant increase in that area. And again, it's changing. And what my concern is the fact that the guidelines, the ANSI guidelines, are these static dimensions, and they don't truly reflect the changes in the demographics of folks with disabilities. And what we're seeing are issues, and I kind of tried to put this into just a couple of the primary barriers. The first barrier is that under the ANSI guidelines, they allow for a wheelchair space of 30 inches by 40 inches. Well, I have many, many individuals who are 48 and 50 inches long. And we have a little demonstration set up back here, so you'll have a chance to understand what I'm talking about. The other thing is that the guideline for residential construction is that doorways only have to be 32 inches wide. This may seem fine, but it's very difficult to do when you're using a wheelchair or a walker. The other thing is that the common code for all hallways in residential construction is that they're 36 inches wide. So these three elements kind of lead for a lot of difficulty for people living in housing, and there's a lot of damage done to housing. You see a lot of holes in walls, nicks, gouges, where people have tried to get around corners in wheelchairs or with walkers. So, okay. What I did next is I went and kind of jumped ahead, and this is an example of the kitchens that come out of some of the fair housing guidelines. This is just your customary U-shaped kitchen, and I forgot to ask for a pointer. But if you see this area right up here, this is the space for a wheelchair. That's a 30 by 40 space for a wheelchair. Now you can sit there and put stuff on the counters. You probably can't get in under the sink. It doesn't have an under counter. And now if you're an elderly woman, you may be in your wheelchair and your chin sits on the counter. The upper cabinets have become pretty much completely inaccessible for many, many folks. And so what you see in their apartments is you see everything that they need on the counter, because they can't reach up. And they can go over here, they can go over there. Now, if they have a motorized chair that's smaller, they might have the turning radiuses to move around. But all the cabinets on the lower end are all dinged. And they've got little scratches and grooves and dents, and so, but yeah, again, it's very limiting. And when we're seeing more folks that are larger, and it's not just issues of obesity. I did training for the U of A College of Architecture with second-year architecture students for many years. And what I found every year was the sensitivity awareness training. And that it became more and more difficult to find equipment like wheelchairs and walkers that would work for the younger students today. Because believe it or not, we're all getting taller. 6'5", 6'7" is not uncommon. And this kitchen, let's say for a male who's 6'7", he would be probably taking up a space of about to there, at least. I mean, and there would be no turning around. He would go in, he would back out. So, okay. The next slide. Okay, and then again, bathrooms actually become even more difficult because, again, you have the 30 by 40 space that's allocated right here in the middle. They do have to be able to clear the door swing, but again, unless you have a wheelchair, especially if it's a manual chair, that has the arm, the side arm that'll pull out of the chair, it's very difficult to transfer onto the toilet and heaven help you with the tub. And what we see often is where people they have attendant care help. That becomes another problem. The attendant care worker has to go in ahead of the person, or they have to kind of crawl over the equipment to get over to help them. So you have a situation of not just the individual with the disability, but also the caregivers at risk. And what I also see happen a lot, because this bathroom design is very common in residential, is that what many folks do is they'll park their wheelchair or their walker right here at the door, and then it's kind of a hit and miss to get across the room because their equipment just doesn't fit in anymore. Okay? Any questions so far? Yes?
What would the ideal hallway dimension be? You said the wheelchairs are 32 to 40.
Well, that's the 30 by 40 is
Yeah.
what is allocated, right? Ideally, 40 inches, but that would take an act of Congress and probably 25 years to make it happen because that is a code that is so deeply entrenched in everything that we work with. It would be very, very hard to get it changed. So, I
have a
wish-
question for
yeah.
the gentlemen that are here with the code enforcement.
Uh-huh.
How would they view, when you're getting a certificate of occupancy or anything, and are they gonna stick hard and fast to the fact that it's not up to code because the hallway might be bigger or something? Wider?
They might, but I would applaud them if a developer made the hallway larger. So,
If they made it larger, that wouldn't be an issue with us generally.
Okay, I'm just curious as to how it would be viewed.
yeah,
We enforce the minimum requirements.
right.
Okay.
Anything above and beyond that, of course, they submit plans and whatever's on the plan is what we expect. That would be at the plan review phase, we would detect that.
Right.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, yes.
Well, I've seen this time and again, the problems is they have their minimums,
Mm-hmm.
but because of the angle, like in the hallway or something.
Exactly.
They can't do that turn
Mhm.
to get into some rooms.
Right, exactly. And that's really probably the fundamental point that I'm trying to make today, is that these guidelines don't provide the flexibility. And again, we're changing, we're evolving. And these are static dimensions. And so, but what I want to do next is I want to just take a couple of items that we use on a pretty regular basis at Direct. And the reason that I'm choosing these two, there's this one and one other, is because they're cost efficient and they're easy to do. You don't have to have a license bonded. You might need somebody with some skill in hanging doors. But in this picture, this is an example of the swing away door hinge. And I have one right here. And I apologize, I wasn't able to get a residential door, but I can pass this around for people. Be careful, it's a little heavy. It's a commercial door hinge. And what this hinge does is it moves, this is a traditional door hinge here. This is the door with the swing away hinge on it. And what happens is the door slides back against the wall. It's flat against the wall. You just have to watch out for the door handle to make sure you don't have a big obstructive door handle. But you can buy someone anywhere from 2 to maybe 3.5 inches of additional space, which it's amazing. And this application on residential door hinges, I would say, because you have 2 hinges, it's probably going to cost you something less than $100. The hinges themselves would probably cost about $40 or $50. So it's an easy application, and it's much cheaper than having to do a major door widening. And the one thing that I like about it, again, is the cost savings. You do get a little bit of adjustment in the door. Sometimes there's a little gap when the door is closed. But it works extremely well in bathrooms, because otherwise, if you don't have that, then you have to take the door off completely sometimes. And I've seen that in many rental situations where people have just taken the door off completely. And that creates a privacy issue and a health safety issue when the door is taken off, because believe it or not, the bathroom door regulates a lot of the temperature in the bathroom. And what we see is that for folks with disabilities, they may not have real good temperature control, and having that door is an essential element. So, and then the next suggestion that I have, this is probably one of my favorites, and this is a wall-mounted slider door. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the pocket slider doors. Well, the pocket slider sits inside the wall. This one sits outside. What I really like about it is that when the door hardware breaks, it's very easy to fix. You don't have to tear the wall out on the pocket slider to replace. And what you do is you can get this type of unit at Home Depot. You buy this, it's called a bypass slider mechanism. I didn't bring a picture of it because it's just all these complicated pieces. And you buy that, and then you can buy any door style you want, and you mount it on the outside. This works really well in open spaces. It is a problem, again, for bathroom doors that are on that 36-inch hall, because the door, and especially if you have any molding down here that you have to account for, the door can sit out about, at the most, probably about 3.5 inches. And again, that limits the space for someone with a wheelchair or a walker. But now, we've used this many times in rooms, and when you put up, like on a white wall, a white door, you don't even really see it. It's almost like it's not even there. And I've known people, they hang artwork on it, and they just slide it back and forth. And it's, again, a very inexpensive solution. The other thing about this that's nice is that you can take off all the door frame molding and just have a solid finish on it. And that molding will probably buy you anywhere from 6 to 8 inches of space. So sometimes that can solve your problem. But like I said, the hard part is in the hallways, you don't really have enough space sometimes to do that. But now, I did have students years ago, I didn't bring this picture, but they did a door that actually, the door is up here, and it's like a roller shade, the door goes up and down. And as long as you don't have any vent work up there, it's an excellent solution. Put the door up top. And I've actually seen, there's a home here in town where the contractor put in a motorized door, and again, it's the roller shade. It's a metal roller shade, and it just rolls up and down. So you can create a lot more space. But sometimes it's hard to convince people that, because we're so accustomed to have everything done a certain way, that it can be done differently and work just as well, if not be better. One of the things that I kind of want to add to this, and then we're going to practice back here with the wheelchairs, is that what we have seen, we have a small grant at Direct. We're doing some minor home modifications for people who are 62 and older who live in rental housing. And what we've seen now, and we've seen it over the years, is that in rental housing, many property owners, managers, developers really prefer to have their elderly and disabled renters, for the plain and simple reason that they generally stay longer, probably on average 10 to 15 years, many of them remain in their units. They also tend to be better tenants. They don't have the big wild parties. And when we first started this small grant that we're doing right now, we weren't getting a big response, but once the word got out, people are like, yeah, we want you to come do grab bars and do some durable medical equipment, these types of things for our residents. It's really needed. So, anything else? And, well, I'm going to ask Jay if he can help me, but I brought some demonstration stuff. That's what this is all set up for you. This is our bathroom doors, right here. This is 32 inches, and this is our 36-inch hallway. And we also have over here a little wheelchair. And then we'll let you guys try it out. It needs to go on. So you can understand. Okay. Now this chair, this chair here is the bariatric wheelchair. These are just customary standard adult-sized chairs. Okay, do I have any volunteers? Michael?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Do you want
Try it out.
do you want the bariatric chair or the regular chair?
Right here. Try this one.
Yeah, okay. Now you can't be in the wall though.
No, I hit the wall. Okay.
Maybe we'll, yeah,
All right.
okay.
I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah, see? Oh,
No.
hit the wall.
All right. I'm not hitting the wall.
Yeah, right. But now you're going to the
Okay,
bathroom.
I'm scraping my knuckles.
Bloody knuckles.
All right.
Yeah, bloody knuckles. Great.
And now, I'll forget it if I gotta turn and go in here, right?
Yeah, you got
I
it.
just stub my toe. And then if I come back too far, the wheel is hitting my heel here. So that's-
Right, yeah.
You spayed it with
I
that
can't
wall.
get through this door. Not without knocking a corner out. So I'd probably have to go this way and then maybe back in. No, that doesn't work either. Never mind.
Across the street.
Maybe the smaller one.
Oh, somebody else
But
want to
yeah,
try the smaller one?
it's not, it's all I can do to just kind of get down the middle of the hallway.
It's been your name, just knock down the wall.
It's a good thing you don't have a real wall there. All right, thank you, Gail. That was very informative. Some other interesting statistics. Last year, on HUD's website, they reported through HUD's Fair Housing Office and their partners such as Southwest Fair Housing Council, over 2,300 complaints alleging discrimination just based on race alone. And I know they've got statistics on discrimination, based on disability. So, that probably is, going to be around the same number is my guess. So, unfortunately, these things still are going on. So, next we'll have Sherry Horbaz, the Director of Education and Outreach. with Southwest Fair Housing Council.
Thank you. All right, you should all have a handout, and it's turned to this page that says disability highlights. Are we missing anyone that doesn't have one? This packet that you have, it's a full packet that we do for educational classes. Southwest Fair Housing, for those that don't know, we do education outreach and enforcement. The classes, we have 3 classes in our office every second Wednesday of the month, and we will come out to properties and do classes as well. But today we're going to talk about disabilities. And that was a great demonstration. It kind of shares with the empathy when you can understand what somebody else has to go through when it's not something you're familiar with. Is this okay? Can you guys hear me? I grew up with a family of 6, and I was the middle child, so I learned to yell really loud for what I wanted. Okay. So when I'm out there teaching and helping providers, housing providers, tenants, realtors, those in the professional market, I'm going to share with you some of the things that I hear from them, and I want to ask you a couple questions as well. So the first way is, how is someone with a disability defined? And this page here tells you that there are 3 ways someone can be defined with a disability. And the first way is the one that I see through cases and through complaints that is usually most violated. And as mentioned earlier, disabilities is the #1 in the state for high violations, and not just Arizona, but across the state. So disability #1 says someone has something that substantially limits a major life function. Can be considered disabled. It's walking, talking, sleeping, thinking, eating, communicating, all the basic things that sometimes I can't do until I get caffeine in the morning. But that's what the first way is, again, something that substantially limits a major life function. The second way says I have a record of such an impairment. And that could be something that I have cancer, I'm in remission. The fact that I'm in remission doesn't mean that my disability has gone away. It just means that I still have my disability and a record of such a disability. The third way is about perception. You perceive me as having a disability, therefore you treat me that way. An example of that would be there was a woman involved in a car fire, her face was severely disfigured, and people treated her like she had a disability because of what they've seen, not because of what she's actually had. But again, once again, the major one violated, the major reason of being disabled and violated is somebody that has something that substantially limits a major life function. Now, when they have this disability, what I see from housing providers is they don't understand that they can ask for reasonable accommodation, reasonable modifications. For the most part, unless it's an egregious discrimination, like I'm in a wheelchair, I want a ramp, and they're told no, they can't have the ramp because it doesn't look pretty. We have to go in and make sure that they're educated that yes, asking for a ramp and being in a wheelchair is related, and they have federal rights to ask for that. But usually what I find is the accommodation seems to be the difficult part. And this says when you have a disability, you have a right to a modification, a change to the structure, and accommodation, which is a change to policies and procedures. So let's pretend that you're all my housing providers. I'm a disabled vet. I've been living with you for 5 years, and I come to you and I know rent's due on the 1st and it's late on the 5th. And I tell you that, hey, I know I don't get my check until the 9th, and I want to pay you on the 10th, and I want you to waive all the late fees now and forevermore. What would you be inclined to tell me? No. And that's pretty common. And the other reasons I hear is if I do it for you, I got to do it for others, right? But if they have a qualified disability and the request is reasonable, that request must be granted. If my sole income is from disability income and it's tied to my disability, then it must be granted. And these are kind of things, examples that I see most don't understand.
Sherry, how would that person prove, what would they be required to provide?
Well, the law says if you can see the disability, you don't necessarily have to provide what I call verification and connection, and it's about halfway down on your page. If they have a disability, what I'm trying to make sure people realize is to have a policy in place that says if you're going to ask me for something, then put it in writing, and then they will repeat that I need something from a healthcare provider that states the nature of the disability and how this is requested. So in this case, for my disabled vet, he could show me an award letter, he could show me a bank statement that shows that it goes into the account, and then waiving the late fees would be a reasonable request. Because there are two ways that someone can deny a request. The one says it has to create a financial burden. And I don't know if going before a judge saying, if I don't get my $25 in late fees, that's gonna create a financial burden, that the judge would see that as something that is real. Of course, the judges are the ones that make the decisions, right? But there has been cases in the past where even with those with SMI, serious mental illness, are unable to manage their own money and have a payee. They need to work with the payee so that payment can be made for the rent, and they're not put out of their home because of all the late fees. Make sense? Yes, ma'am.
So this is a federal law?
Federal law protects those with disabilities. They have rights and they have responsibilities. Now, pets seem to be the sore spot sometimes when I'm out there. They don't want to have, they want to have the pet deposits because all animals must destroy apartments. I don't know why that is, but that's the thought out there. You cannot be charged a pet deposit or a pet fee if you have a qualified animal. One way of finding out if you have a qualified animal is to have that policy in place that asks for verification and connection. And in this case, it would be something from a healthcare provider that states why the animal is necessary for the nature of that disability. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Does that go both for a service animal and a companion animal?
If you, later on when you get a chance to look through the packet, one of the slides I used during the training is it lists a comfort animal, a therapeutic animal, assistive animal. I mean, there's a long list of things people call these animals. And in the past, service animal has been meant as something that has been specifically trained. Now, the Americans with Disability Act came out and said, okay, we're gonna define our animal, service animal, true service animal, as a dog or a mid-sized horse, and it has to be specifically trained. So what that means is you can no longer take your pot-bellied pig out to the buffet. It has to be a dog or a mid-sized horse. Yes. And if you come to the class on the second Wednesday of the month, or you call when we come out to your property, you'll see a picture of what that looks like. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Does that include waiving like the outrageous deposit they charge?
They can be charged no fees, whether they want to call it a pet fee, a rent pet fee, a temporary pet fee. I'm not sure, we're getting creative now on the ways we call our fees, but anything to do with the animals, we can't charge those additional fees. So then they want to know, well, what am I going to do about all the damage that these animals do if I can't charge a security deposit, right? Because we know they all cause damage. So what can I do about that? Do I have to wait till we kick them out at the end? And what I tell them is no. If they're doing, maintenance checks on their properties or your assets, then there shouldn't be any issue. When you go in to change the filters, of course, the Landlord-Tenant Act says you must give them 48 hours notice. You give them that notice. You go in, you change the filters. And if you see something's wrong, maybe someone has taken the wall and that's their anger management, then you give them a 10-day notice to comply for the Landlord-Tenant Act, because it's not a health and safety issue. And then you make them pay for repairs. If you see anything beyond the normal wear and tear, per the Landlord-Tenant Act, then you can give them a notice and have it fixed right then and there. Okay? Now, why do you suppose all these people get these perks? These people with disability, they get front door parking. They can come right out here. They get special rules for them. Why did all these people with disabilities get perks? I know, it's crazy she said they get perks, huh? Well, some people will admit that they think that they're getting perks, but really they're not. What the law is saying, federal law is saying, is let's make it a level playing field. If you had to get up, if I had a physical disability and I needed to get up and get in my car, get into my shower, my wheelchair, get into my shower, use the grab bar, get into my special car, all those things allow me to work and enjoy life just like you without a physical disability. So the purpose of the law is to level the playing field. If I didn't have a place, if I was in the wheelchair and we asked Marcos to go to the movies, well, he wouldn't be able to get down there and watch a movie if we didn't have a spot for them, right? So it's not like they get front door parking or they get front door show rights. It's so that we can level the playing field and treat everybody as equal as possible, and they have the right to live like everyone else. All right. So back to the one question, it doesn't matter what you call the animal, whether it's service, assistive, Can a comfort animal be an animal for a disability? Yes, it can be. So let me ask you, is there a difference between the word handicap and disability under our federal fair housing and state fair housing laws? And what is it? One means something and another one means something else?
Is one permanent and the other is temporary?
Oh, no, that's good, that's good. If I had my prizes with me, you would win a prize. For those that have taken my class, Judge Sherry finds you when you're right, or she finds you when you're wrong. Because we gotta get through a lot of no's to get to the yeses. Okay, so temporary and permanent. Disability would be permanent?
Permanent.
Okay, and handicap would be,
I don't know.
okay, no, oh, no, let's keep
Could
going.
be temporary.
Okay, so one's mental, one's physical? Gail?
Can I tell them?
Yes, you may, ma'am.
Okay. The word handicap came from the blind man standing on the street corner with his cap as the paper. And that is very offensive to the disability community. We don't choose to be seen as beggars. And that's why the term has evolved to individuals with disabilities. That it's a person-centered movement about people.
So, to the answer to the question, is there a difference in our fair housing laws? No, it doesn't matter. You can use the word disability, you can use the word handicap. HUD uses the word handicap throughout their literature quite frequently. The Americans with Disability Act uses disability through their literature quite frequently. And I'm understanding the preference is special needs instead of just disability or handicap. Maybe special needs is more the terminology. But it's interesting to me when I go out and talk to people and get the perceptions that maybe there is a difference, and what is the difference, and why it has been seen as physical or mental. You know, why one means one or the other. But they don't. They're the same under the Fair Housing Act. And if you get a qualified request, you must answer the request within a timely manner. And again, the modifications are the easiest. The accommodations sometimes aren't so easy. So if I'm a person with arthritis, let's say I come out to visit you, and I can't make the trash can, and you've got maintenance that comes on site twice a week. And I come to you and I say, you know what, I want you to come to my house every day and dump my trash. That's my reasonable accommodation. What do you think you'd say? Heck no, right? Another thing I see out of the case studies and the things that come through and in and out of our office is people are missing that interactive process. I mentioned earlier that said if it created a financial burden, and in this case, if you only got maintenance that goes out twice a week, you would have to pay someone to go, and so it could be a legitimate reason why you're going to deny this is because it would create a financial burden. But what we're not seeing, or what I don't see, is that interactive process. If we can't do that, what can we do? Because even able-bodied people are having a hard time making a trash can, right? So if we have this issue already and this other issue isn't going to go away, maybe we can start thinking about the interactive process and making it work. So what could we do? We could probably get a trash can. She could get a trash can that's bigger, save up her trash, have maintenance do it twice a week. We could probably look at the trash can that's out there and get one of those side ones. And that way everyone can make the trash, right? Because I hear from maintenance a lot, nobody makes the trash. So this one issue isn't going to go away. But getting a side trash can, so that the side door one, then they can make it and that would work. So think about if you get these requests and you can't do them for whatever reason, one of the two reasons you can't do them, and what can we do? Because the issue isn't going to go away, right? Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I wanted to give you, that's okay. The last thing I want to kind of share with you is the fact that when you get requests and you're not sure what to do, who are you going to reach out to? That's right, Southwest Fair Housing Counselor. And there's brochures back there. Should you need help, but that's what we are. We're a statewide resource. We've got lots of persons with educated experience in the field here to help you. So if you're not sure about whether you should say yes, something sounds funny, you've heard a story, something's not sounding quite right, be sure that you send them our way. Because that's what we're here for. We represent one race, the human race. And that's all of you, regardless of what occupation you're in, regardless of whatever you're doing. We want to be sure to help you. Okay? All right, and I think that's, oh, we didn't even scroll, huh? Okay. No. That's okay. Go ahead and go through all the way. The last thing I want to share is about restoration, because I do get this question quite often. When we talked about reasonable modification, we have a qualified request, a lot of people feel that sometimes the apartment may have to be restored back to its original way it was. And that's not necessarily true. If it impairs the next person moving in, then it could make sense that it has to be restored. For example, I'm in a wheelchair, I'm in a non-accessible unit, I pay to have all the cabinets lowered. You as the housing provider don't want to keep it as an accessible unit that may impair the next person moving in, so I may have to put money in escrow to restore the cabinets back to regular height. Yes?
So if a unit is modified and changed in some way to accommodate the disability, who pays for that cost?
In the cases of those properties that are federally funded, they pay for it. When they take some of that monies, they promise to make any modifications, it has to be reasonable, they pay for it. If it's a non-federal funded property, the tenant pays for it. So, and again, that depends, and there's resources that they can reach out to if they're having difficulty paying for some of the modifications.
So then when you're talking about restoring, if they made modifications,
They would have to restore it if it's in a
and the same
non-federal funded
cost would
property.
apply to the tenant, if it was non-federally funded property, the tenant would need to pay, the tenant leaving would need to pay for it?
Yes, to have it restored, but that's something that you work out in the beginning of the process. Now remember, any modifications have to be done in a work person-like manner. Licensed, bonded, insured,
Yeah.
they can ask for that information. But if for some reason the housing provider doesn't want to keep it as an accessible unit, which I don't know why, because it's just done professionally, but let's say that they don't, then they would have to put, in the beginning, put money aside in escrow to put that back up. Yes, ma'am?
I was just gonna say that what we've seen at Direct over the years is the fact that some of the most accessible units in this town never go out on like the sort of the public market, because it passes from one person with a disability to their friend. Because it's so hard to find accessible units.
Yeah. I've had a few that, want to say that any changes made, has to be restored, and that is not always the case. If I put in a ceiling fan, that might not impair the next person moving in, so it doesn't have to be restored. My handles, typically on apartments, they're round. Maybe with arthritis, I use the lever handles. That's not going to impair the next person moving in. If I choose to leave them as the tenant, they can choose whether to mix them or to match them or not. Yes, ma'am?
Is the training the same for these different kinds of dogs that are listed here, therapeutic, service, comfort, so forth? The training that's required for those dogs to become a certified dog?
Under the Americans with Disability Act, they have to be specifically trained. Under fair housing, they do not have to have the training. What they do have to have, and we're trying to get everybody into the idea of having a business relationship and create a policy that says they need verification and connection. Something that shows, something from a healthcare provider states the nature of the disability and how this request is connected. Because you've seen dogs that can sniff out cancer, right? And they didn't go to medical school. Dogs who have helped families out of a fire, and they didn't go to firefighting school, although they do make calendars though, right?
They're cute calendars.
Yes, ma'am.
I just went to a handy dogs thing on distinction between all these animals. And the ESA, the emotional support animal, can be any animal. Where the service dog can only be a dog or a mini horse.
Well, now remember, that's Americans with Disability Act. In housing, it can be any animal. I have a slide that I show that shows, Sherry's in need of her pet squirrel, Rocky. She suffers from extreme bouts of anxiety. This pet creates a sense of security for her. That would be my verification and connection. Did the squirrel have any training? In this case, let's say no, because they don't have to have the training to be considered an accommodation. And that's another, fallacy out there, is they have to have the specialized training.
Right,
Or-
well, when you said that if the dog tore up something, and I was thinking about the fact that service dogs are trained not to do that kind
Right.
of stuff, but what you're saying
I
is.
can
it
have
could
a
be
comfort dog, I can
Yeah,
have a
that's
therapeutic
interesting.
dog, I can have an assistive dog. And sometimes people don't know what label to stick on it. So that's why I try to teach people, if you get the verification and connection, that's all you need.
Interesting, thank you.
Do they need to have shots verified
If
as
you
part
have-
of the fair housing?
If you can have it part of a health and safety issue, so, for those that have pets, you can do anything you want with pets. You can say, I want one cat, has to have a pink leash, it has to sing on Wednesday nights, that's your pet rules. Then you want to say, these rules don't apply to qualified animals. And anything underneath that are all health and safety rules that apply to all animals. They must be inoculated, health and safety, they have to be on a leash when they're out, they have to pick up their poop when they're outside. All the health and safety concerns now apply to all animals, whether a qualified animal or a pet. Okay? Yes, ma'am?
Are they limited to only having one?
No. If I can show that each animal serves a different function through my verification and connection is what we're trying to stress, then I can have more than one. Now, the law says it really doesn't have to be in writing, but we're trying to push a business atmosphere out there to have housing providers have this in a policy so that it's in writing. First thing is, anything you get, ask for it in writing, so then they can properly approve, deny, and go through the process. And that way it shows a trail. But honestly, the law doesn't say it has to be in writing. It's just trying to say, okay, we have this policy, let's put it in place and get everybody, so that they know what the rules are. And once they know the rules, they know how to play, right? But the key is you gotta know what the rules are, and it helps with consistency in your patterns and practices if you have these rules in place and they're known. They have to be known. Yes, sir?
Who needs to provide the note or the verification? Is it a doctor specifically, or?
No, that's why the term is on your paper, healthcare provider. Does not have to be a doctor. It can be a nurse practitioner, it could be a psychiatrist, sorry. Sorry. Psychiatrist. It could be someone who's familiar with the disability. Case managers have written it, and then there's always the pushback. You can go online and get the note, and not have to pay. Does everybody break the rules? No. Do some people break the rules? Probably. But on the other end, when you're getting this verification and connection, if you have it in front of you, take it unless you want to, spend a lot of money in attorney fees. So, good question. Any other questions for me? Let me encourage you to send everybody you know to the class. I would hope that everybody takes the fair housing class at least annually, if not semi-annually. Give us a call. We have a team. Joanne is one of the teams, and we have Stavko as one of our teams out of the Phoenix office. But with that, I'm hoping we are on track. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my passion.
Thank you, Sherry. And it looks like we are still on track. That's very interesting. We were doing monitoring last month in Ajo, and the landlord there at one of the developments that we funded had an issue related to a tenant that had a therapeutic animal, which was a cat, interestingly. I don't know if they got a letter, but the issue was that their policies require all pets to be registered and vaccinated, and so this particular tenant had not done that, and so that was the main issue. And I don't know if they got a note from a healthcare provider for the therapeutic cat, but the cat was not registered or vaccinated, so that's the issue that's being dealt with. And so if that issue continues, the tenant does not register the animal or get it vaccinated, and the landlord then, the next step for them is to evict this tenant. Are they violating any of the fair housing laws by doing that?
I would say the vaccination could be considered health and safety. You know, ultimately, it's the judge that's gonna make that decision, but if health and safety is the vaccination, I would say that, you know, they at least should do that, but get it vaccinated.
Okay, good. That's good advice. I mean, it is, you know, I'm sure our county code requires that all animals be vaccinated and registered. And all the other tenants' pets are registered and vaccinated as well, so they are applying the policy equally, so. All right, thank you very much. We do have Betty Villegas now that has joined us, and our director, Margaret Kish, in back. And Betty, did you want to say a few words before the next presenter? Okay. So next we will have Jay Young, who's the executive director with Southwest Fair Housing Council, and he'll continue with his presentation here.
Thank you, Marcos. Good morning. My name is Jay Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Fair Housing Council, as Marcos mentioned. Again, I'd like to welcome everybody this morning and thank you for coming. One of the things that I've learned working at the Southwest Fair Housing Council is as a team, we are very effective, but what makes us infinitely more effective is working with our partners in the community. So developing these relationships and continuing these relationships really helps us to do our job much more effectively. So again, thank you for coming, and thank you for partnering with us. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk, Martha, if you could, yeah, there we go. I'm going to talk about the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. I'm going to give some background about the AI and the components of the AI, the disability-related issues in the AI, geographical concentrations of persons with disabilities. I'm going to talk about national and local enforcement trends, and I'm going to talk about the impediment and action step that's in the AI that the city and county have agreed to take. Next slide. So the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice is a standalone document. It's also part of the consolidated plan that the city and county have to do as a requirement for CDBG funding. So really any jurisdiction like the city of Tucson and Pima County that's an entitlement jurisdiction is required to produce this document. It's done every 5 years, more or less, and what the document ultimately is trying to do is identify the fair housing impediments within the jurisdiction and then create an action plan to remedy those impediments. Next slide, please. The main components of the AI. So the AI starts with a demographic overview. And what we're trying to do with the demographic overview is we are trying to look at the demographic characteristics of, in this case, Tucson and Pima County that are most closely related to fair housing. So we will look at things like the age distribution of the community. We'll look at racial and ethnic characteristics of the community. We'll look at housing characteristics, any number of demographic elements that may be most closely related to fair housing. So in this instance, we would look at age distribution, and if the jurisdiction maybe skews older, we would want to point that out because as people age, they often develop more disabilities, and since disability is protected under the Fair Housing Act, that's something that we would want to highlight. The next thing that the AI does, which to me really is the heart of the AI, is that we identify protected class concentrations within the jurisdiction. And we do that using GIS mapping and statistics from the US Census. And the reason that we want to identify these protected class concentrations is because I think a lot of people don't know that the Fair Housing Act in a lot of ways really has two components. The Fair Housing Act demands that we deal with discrimination today, that we prevent discrimination, that we prosecute those that have discriminated illegally. But then there's this other component that's known as affirmatively furthering fair housing. And essentially what that means is that jurisdictions that receive federal funding need to identify racial and ethnic concentrations of poverty, other protected class concentrations, because they have an affirmative duty to alleviate those segregated housing patterns. So essentially, the Fair Housing Act is saying to a jurisdiction, you need to look back at the history of your community and identify segregated housing patterns that may have developed through government policy, through private policy, however those have developed, in order to alleviate those going forward and essentially create integrated communities. So I think that that's an often overlooked piece of the Fair Housing Act, but is a very important piece and is still, frankly, quite controversial today oftentimes. Once those protected class concentrations are identified, then a jurisdiction can look at its programs and policies and projects to see if they are exacerbating segregated housing patterns or alleviating segregated housing patterns. And it really creates a mechanism to do fair housing planning so that fair housing is a part of the dialogue and discussion when these programs and projects that federal money is paying for are going into effect. The next thing that we do is we do a HMDA analysis, and HMDA stands for Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and we look at the data from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and what that can tell us, it can tell us mortgage lending patterns in the community, and it can really show racial and ethnic patterns as it relates to mortgage lending in the community. We also look for community input as much as possible. We have a survey. We do interviews with stakeholders. We do a couple of focus groups. So HUD is really wanting community input, and as it turns out, over the next couple of years, HUD is really revamping some of this and is likely going to demand even more community input to really understand what's happening in communities. You can look at data on one hand and statistics, which does tell you something, but also you want to have the voice of the community adding to the document as well. And then finally, we look at all of the research and data that we've collected, all of the input, and we, along with, in this case, the Southwest Fair Housing Council that put this document together for the city and county, we will talk to the city and county and come up with impediments, and with the fair housing impediments based on the data, and then create an action plan to deal with those impediments. Next slide. So what I want to do now is I want to pull out some of the disability-related issues that we found in this AI. One of the things that we highlighted, as a matter of fact, is that both the city and county have an inclusive design ordinance, they have separate inclusive design ordinances, but that are basically the same. And these ordinances are some of the most progressive in the country, and Tucson and Pima County are one of only a handful of jurisdictions that have something like this. And essentially, new construction in the city and county has to meet accessibility guidelines that are above and beyond what's required. So I think that that's worth highlighting, and we did in this AI. Another piece of information is that there's a lot of old housing stock in the city and the county. It's especially true in the city of Tucson, and the reason that that is an issue is because older housing stock is generally less accessible. If you compare that to the new accessibility ordinances that the city and the county have, and compare that to what was built 30, 40, 50, or even 90 years ago, there's quite a difference there. In the jurisdiction, 20% of the population is over age 65. Well, why is that an issue? According to the census, over 40% of those over age 65 have at least one disability. So you've got a large population in the jurisdiction that's over 65, and that population experiences a high rate of disability. The disability rates themselves in Tucson, it's about 14% of the population. In Pima County, it's about 13%. And one of the things that I wanted to note about the populations, persons with disabilities in this community, is the next statistic. Those that have a disability, 29% of those with disability in Tucson live in poverty, and in Pima County that is pushing 19%. So there's a direct relation to persons with disabilities having a higher percentage of poverty. So I think that's definitely worth noting. The other thing that I think is interesting about this statistic is Tucson actually has a significantly younger population than the county as a whole. So based on what I said before, that older folks are often experiencing more disability, why is it then that Tucson, that has a younger population, has a higher percentage of persons with disabilities in poverty? Well, in general, there's a higher concentration of persons in poverty in Tucson as compared to the county. I think also the housing generally in Tucson is cheaper often than in the county. And then there's greater access to transit within the city as well. So if you have a disability and you can't drive, you may want to live closer to transit, which is more accessible in the city. And then again, as I mentioned, older housing in Tucson is an issue because of the accessibility. So there are a number of different things that we can look at here and try and determine, what the situation is in terms of persons with disabilities in this jurisdiction. The next thing I want to point out, I'm going to pull up Martha, could you pull the map up and put it up on the screen? It's on the desktop. I'm going to have Martha pull up a map that we created. It's actually not in the draft AI, but will end up being in the final draft. Yeah, it's that one, I believe. Oh, yeah, that's it. Okay, so this is a map that we created using GIS and data that's available from the census. And what this shows is population of persons with disabilities under 65 years old. So this is taking out those over 65. So this is essentially, I guess you could think of it as a working age population. And it's showing concentration. So the dark red areas in that particular tract, 12 to 16% of the entire population has a disability. And then the less red and then the shaded areas on down show the percentage of persons with disabilities. And what I think is interesting about this map as well, and if you were to look at some of the other maps and data that we have in the AI, is that the lightest area has the smallest percentage of persons with disabilities. And you can see the foothills. Everyone knows that that's a higher income area. And this part of the city of Tucson is also generally kind of a higher income area. The Sam Hughes area, some areas around Reed Park that are quite high income. And you can see that those high income areas have the smallest percentage of persons with disabilities. So again, there's that relationship between income, poverty, and disability. So we can go back to the PowerPoint. We've mentioned a couple of trends about disability today, and I'd like to dive into those a little bit more. So nationally, in 2013, there were about 27,000 housing discrimination complaints, and these came from local governments, state governments. They went through HUD, the Arizona Attorney General's office, through offices and organizations like the Southwest Fair Housing Council. They've been pretty consistent, a little higher than in 2011, but consistent with 2012. And between 2003 and 2013, there were between 25 and 31,000 complaints filed every year on a national level. What's interesting about that, the National Fair Housing Alliance, which is an organization that represents organizations like the Southwest Fair Housing Council, but on the national level, they estimate that only 1% of all discrimination cases are ever taken to the complaint level. So the vast majority of illegal housing discrimination that occurs in this country is not reported. So I think that's important to remember. Private fair housing organizations like the Southwest Fair Housing Council file 70% of all complaints. And interestingly, disability, as I'll show you in some of the statistics that follow, is far and away the complaint that's brought the most, followed by race, national origin, and familial status. Next slide, please. HUD Region 9. So HUD Region 9, that's the region that we're in. It's Arizona, California, and Nevada. 32% of all complaints nationwide came from Region 9, so a lot of complaints are coming out of this region. And you can see 52% of the complaints out of Region 9 were disability, which dwarfs the other categories. Familial status at 12%, race at about 12%, national origin at 10%, and sex at 4.2%. So what this statistic shows is that disability is far and away what we deal with the most, and when we file complaints or when complaints are filed in Region 9, that's what we're seeing. Pima County. So this is data from the Southwest Fair Housing Council for a year, July 1st, 2013 to June 30th, 2014. Out of 307 client contacts that we had, 19 complaints were filed based on those contacts. And out of the contacts that where discrimination was alleged, you can see that the percentages pretty closely match the region, which I think is interesting. So, you know, what's going on in Tucson and Pima County in Arizona really matches essentially the entire HUD region. So again, disability at 56 dwarfs the other protected class the protected class complaints. So familial status, race, national origin, sex, and then virtually nothing for religion or color. Yes?
Why do you think that exists? I'm just curious.
I think that, and Sherry I think can add to this as well, but I think it's because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of modifications and accommodations. What would?
I think we've been telling them all along through all the other protected classes minus disability, treat them the same, treat them the same, treat them the same. And now disability comes along, and so it's still foreign to them to understand the elements of disability because they want to treat them the same. If I do it for you, I got to do it for another one. But they don't realize that this is now a separate exception that we're going to look at on a case-by-case basis and make accommodations. They still have some of their hard, and everybody wants something for nothing. So.
I think there's also the piece that a lot of people, I think when they think of the Fair Housing Act and housing discrimination are immediately thinking race and ethnicity. But of course there are 7 protected classes, disability being one. So I think a lot of people aren't fully aware of all of the classes that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. So I think that plays a role as well. Yeah.
Of the 307 client contacts, 19 complaints were filed. What happened to the 298 others? Is there a mediation process that goes into place when a complaint is filed
Well, there are a number of different things that could have happened. Some of those client contacts, maybe we determined that the person maybe thought that they were experiencing illegal discrimination, but it was really a Landlord-Tenant Act, or we could make a phone call to the landlord and help to mediate that situation. And some of the complaints are clearly fair housing complaints. Some of them maybe less so, but people still want to file a complaint, which is their right, even if maybe it's not the strongest complaint. Does that answer?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Next slide, yes, fair housing impediment number 8. So as I mentioned, the analysis of impediments, or the AI, ends up identifying fair housing impediments. Fair housing impediment number 8 in the AI, which as I mentioned and want to mention again, is currently available for public comment. It's on the county's website. I can also get you a copy if you would like to look at it in more detail and provide comments during this period. But the current draft, fair housing impediment number 8, states that there's a lack of accessible housing, particularly for families with persons with disabilities in the region. Southwest Fair Housing Council's enforcement program receives regular contact from people about lack of accessible housing and frequent denial of reasonable accommodations and modifications. So that's, I think, what we mentioned earlier and what kind of Sherry was alluding to as well. Next slide, please. So the action steps that the city and county have agreed to take. The city and county will make increasing accessible housing a priority. They will do this in two ways in particular noted in the AI. Create, expand, and support programs that provide assistance to low-income households to make accessibility modifications to homes and rental units. And then the second, continue to enforce the Pima County Inclusive Design Ordinance for new construction, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. So that's my presentation. Thank you again for coming. If you have any questions, I will take them now. I can talk to you afterwards as well. If you need to contact me or our team for any reason, this is our contact information. So please, as Sherry mentioned, do not hesitate to contact us if you've got a question, think something is amiss in your community, whatever the case may be, we're here to serve. Yes?
What is the possible discrimination against people with a mental illness?
Sherry?
I didn't get a question. I'm sorry.
What is the possible example of discrimination against someone with a mental illness as their disability?
I'm a person of Tourette's. I get up at 3 in the morning, I'm screaming and hollering, and she's my neighbor. She goes down to the office below and says, hey, you need to evict her. She's just keeping me up. And they're not quite sure what to do with me because I am, against her peaceful, quiet, and enjoyment. So they may not realize that we need to go through this interactive process, even come talk to me. Maybe I changed my medication. I need an additional 3 days. Then my issue goes away and we're all good. But they don't understand that, so they just know me as a problem and let's get rid of the issue. Because awareness is half the battle.
Yeah.
So 5 years ago, you did the analysis for the previous 5-year consolidated plan. So in updating the plan for the current 5-year consolidated plan, updating your analysis rather, did you find that the programs and projects that took place within that period had a positive or negative impact on your data?
Well, I think ultimately what our conclusions are is that, we've worked with numerous jurisdictions throughout the state and some out of state as well. And ultimately, I think to Pima County and the city of Tucson's credit, they're actually very interested in fair housing, and affirmatively furthering fair housing really aligns a lot with the goals and things that they have already. So I think that in this community, there's a lot of progress that's being made to continue to incorporate fair housing planning into how projects, programs, et cetera, are being developed. And I think that it's an ongoing challenge. Oftentimes when I work with jurisdictions, there'll be some back and forth, and oftentimes there's a comment that, well, some of the things that the federal government is asking us to do makes it difficult sometimes for us to affirmatively further fair housing. And I say, well, just because HUD is requiring this to be completed, this AI, doesn't mean that the federal government is not also at times an impediment to fair housing. So, a lot of the things that I think that communities are trying to remedy now in terms of segregated housing patterns were, created because of federal policy. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think that, again, the city and county's work with the Southwest Fair Housing Council and their desire to really use fair housing planning to further the goals that they have already really show that this community is moving forward in a way that I think a lot of other communities could be envious of. So, yeah.
I was just gonna see, can the city or the county give more background on this impediment number 8 that you spoke about?
How so?
What specifically, so maybe some of the plans are, if you're gonna increase more accessible housing or rental housing in the communities?
Well, I think that what the AI does is, with the impediments in the action plan, it sets up the kind of framework moving forward. So over the next 5 years, I think that the way the city and county looks at it is they're making the commitment, and through the programs and policies and whatnot, that they will continue to look for funding and be aware that this is an issue. So, you know, I didn't mean to speak for you, Betty, but
No, that's exactly right, and we can start with our, public works or planning department, what are some of the, barriers there and what are some of the challenges to them, because, the opposition, of course, is always an issue. And how can we bring everyone together, just like we did with the inclusive design, to make it work for everyone? Do you want to add anything?
And, the other things that we can do is, with the funding applications, we have, scoring criteria and evaluation criteria, and we've made changes to those, and we continue to, as, we get new information like this, so we've added, preference points for projects that go above and beyond the minimum requirements, for multifamily housing. It's not very hard to meet that minimum requirement as far as accessible units, so we will, encourage projects to go above and beyond that by, providing additional points, and that makes a difference when, funding is competitive, so.
Yeah, and we can only control where we have funding for these developments. If we don't have any funding in there, then, for it to be just a market condition, that requires everyone to come together. But we do, as Marco said, and, Tom will agree, we protect, through the application process, we try to include a lot of these accessibility issues.
Okay, let's go ahead and get back to our seats, please. I'll use the microphone to get everybody back. Get it. All right. Next up, we have Stephanie Parker. She's an experienced psychologist, activist, mediator, founder and CEO of the Aurora Foundation of Southern Arizona and Change Leaders Consulting and Research Group. And they provide workshops regarding disability justice issues, and as well as publishing a number of editorials and publications on the issue. So let's welcome Stephanie Parker.
Thank you, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. This is not on. I'll speak loud. No, that's all right. No, I can voice it out there. So, yeah, I'm very pleased to be here and really honored to be here and to present some ideas to you about invisible disabilities and fair housing. And yes, just like you, still working for equality and fair housing. We can't do this alone. We can only do it together. So, so sometimes disabilities are invisible. Here's a whole bunch of people lined up to go into a movie in someplace back in Maryland. Can you spot anybody there who has a disability?
Everybody.
Any of them have a disability. Most disabilities, 57 million people in the United States report having a disability. And some of those people don't necessarily report, but do have a disability. Invisible disabilities in this country are huge in terms of numbers. 1 out of every 2 people has an invisible disability. So look around. So what are the outcomes I hope to see happen from this presentation? First of all, we need to raise awareness of the millions of persons with invisible disabilities, millions of them. We also need to continue to revisit the definition of disability per the Fair Housing Act. And Sherry went over this a little bit earlier, but Per the Fair Housing Act, the disability must substantially limit one or more major life activities, as Sherry shared with us earlier. The disability doesn't have to be obvious. People don't need to be able to know you have a disability just from seeing you or even spending time with you. Your disability doesn't have to require you to use any assistive device for the FHA. Your disability doesn't have to be physical. You could have chronic fatigue syndrome, learning disability, a mental illness. And by the way, addictions are disabilities too. People who have a drug or alcohol addiction qualify as having a disability. And a landlord can't just simply decide that you pose a threat just on a hunch. That person must be able to point to specific past behavior that would justify either rejecting a rental application or evicting the tenant. We need to spotlight fair housing issues confronting people with invisible disabilities, especially those with mental health disabilities. I want to talk with you and share with you a little bit about what I call the wall of exclusion. This is the foundation of social inequities. There are 3 building blocks to this wall of exclusion. You've heard about the wall of silence, but this is the wall of exclusion. Stigma is one of those building blocks. It's a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance or a person. The second building block is stereotyping, and we all know about that. It's taking a unidimensional view of a person, and we stereotype all the time, it seems like, and we are not always aware that we're doing that. The third building block of this wall of exclusion is discrimination. It's unjust, prejudicial treatment of different categories of people. And in this case, we're talking about people with disabilities, invisible and visible disabilities. So that's the wall of exclusion. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about coming out, or how does somebody with an invisible disability come out, disclose to somebody else their disability. So those are the outcomes ones we hope to see happen today. Matters that count for people with disabilities, visible and invisible. People with disabilities are among a class of groups protected by the Fair Housing Act, as we learned earlier. Race and color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, and familial status. These are the protected groups, protected classes. Another important idea here is about, important matter is about the idea of steering. This is age-old, this idea of steering. It's really an indirect form of housing discrimination, and it's very common. So you go in to speak with somebody about an apartment, and that person, or housing of some kind, and that person guides you or encourages you to look someplace else, that this is not the right place for you. So they're steering people in a direction that they don't necessarily want to go into. And then again, the wall of exclusion. And this isn't just somebody's problem. This is a community problem, stereotyping and discrimination and stigma. This is a community problem. And so without safe housing for persons with invisible disabilities, especially those with mental disabilities, these individuals end up homeless, they're on the streets, in state-run hospitals, and in prison. This results from insufficient safe and insufficient affordable housing for people. So when fair housing for people with invisible and visible disabilities is accessible, it's affordable, it's accommodated, it's stable, then from that we find that there is a stable, positive, and productive outcomes for that individual. So those are the matters that count. They're very important. So, just a little bit about numbers here, just a few numbers. Approximately 96% of the people live, in this country, live with a diagnosed illness, a disability that is invisible. 96%. And these people often do not use a cane or any assistive device and may look perfectly healthy to the outside world. It's estimated by 2020 more than 157 million Americans will be afflicted by a chronic illness. 157 million people. The divorce rate among the chronically ill individuals exceeds 75% due to, in large part, the chronic illness. Depression is 15 to 20% higher for the chronically ill than for the average person. And physical illness or uncontrollable physical pain are major factors in up to 70% of suicides. So invisible disabilities are very, very injurious to people in their relationships. So just a smattering, just an idea of the kinds of invisible disabilities, as you can see. And this is just a handful. Just a handful. Taking a look briefly at, say, for example, cognitive disorders, these disorders are things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease, traumatic brain injury, autism, ADHD, and many more. And the individuals who have these cognitive disorders have trouble understanding and connecting with others, a fear of social situations, poor judgment and insight, poor impulse control, short-term memory, trouble with critical thinking skills, often anger, and a whole plethora of descriptors about cognitive disorders. And individuals with mental health disabilities are right in this category, along with many others. This is important to understand. So it's important to identify and gain a better understanding of the intersection between mental illness and housing. And one of the biggest issues some people with mental illness face is the availability of housing and being able to sustain a recovery process. If you have an accessible, accommodated, safe and secure housing situation, then it's going to add and contribute to the success of the recovery. They go hand in glove. Good housing, stable housing, and advancement in recovery. So having a safe and secure place to live is an important part of recovery. And along with access to services that enable people with mental health conditions to live as independently in the least restrictive setting as possible. So when an individual is living where violence and trauma are an everyday occurrence, where pollution from landfills and industrial plants and refineries is thick in community neighborhoods, and where residents are at or below the poverty level, all of this affects mental health. Safe, secure, and affordable fair housing provides a strong support for people with mental illness. One of the things we might not consider very often when we think about fair housing is the idea of the cultural issues that come to bear in terms of being able to access and maintain fair housing. Two of the protected classes, ethnicity and national origin, these are these are the kinds of cultures that people who come to this country have, meaning a culture of being able to be with one another, to promote the cultural traditions, where people are able to celebrate their culture and so forth. This is an important aspect of the housing that people gain when they come in. And for us to be aware of that and to appreciate that is very, very important. So when we think about somebody with an invisible disability, think about what it means to them to disclose or to come out to somebody else. Let's say that, just to pretend, somebody out here has an invisible disability, and you believe that it is time for you to share this invisible disability with others. It could be a friend, it could be your employer, it could be your landlord. So let's pretend. Let's say somebody out here has this invisible disability. What would you say, and how would you say it to, say, a landlord? Anybody want to take that on? You really want this housing. You really want it, and you have an invisible disability. It could be a mental illness. It could be anything else. But how would you do that? What would you say? Yes?
Just according to what Sherry had mentioned, if you're approaching a landlord and you want to start on a proper, relationship with that landlord, whatever the issue is, I would say, I want to rent here, I want to live here, it's perfect for me, but I want to disclose this to you and go from there. Whatever, and here's a letter stating that, situation to some extent, and that's what I would do.
That sounds very reasonable. Absolutely, absolutely. If somebody has an invisible disability, and that is a disability that is difficult for that person to share with others, there are ways that a person can structure how to do this. In other words, how to come out. The first thing I think the person needs to understand is, who am I talking to? If I'm talking to a friend, I would frame it in a different way than if I were talking to my employer. If I'm talking to a random person, to frame it in a way that's related to the context and the person that you're talking to. So, given the person and his or her role in my relationship, for example, coming out message I would craft in a context-related way, the context of our relationship, what that is. I would be very careful. To parse the information and the message to that person, and with an emotionally appropriate tone. So where I'm going with this is that this is something that an individual with a hidden disability needs to carefully craft, rather than to just kind of pop it out there, to craft it carefully. And then the second thing is knowing why. What's the reason for me to be sharing this? To disclose to people who's connected to me in some part of my life. So coming out to your employer as having an invisible disability is because you want to be able to have the accommodation you need to be as successful as you can in your job. And coming out to a fair housing landlord for an accommodation so that you can feel safe, secure and have full use and enjoyment of your home is another reason why to come out. You want to have full enjoyment, secure and safe home. How to do this, how to tell people is equally important. The how of this is not only socially appropriate to do this, to disclose, but also to determine how much I really want to disclose. So I have to have some careful thinking going on behind all of this. How much do I want to disclose? I get to choose, because nobody knows that I have this disability until I tell them. So, and then when I disclose this invisible disability to an apartment manager, to a landlord, is important. And I need to plan ahead on this and not be kind of flip about this. I need to plan ahead. So usually with employers, I want to disclose right away if I need any accommodations. It's also a good idea for me to look ahead to the future and the potential housing issues that I might be confronting, and be ready to do this. Be ready with all of these steps to do this, and do it in a way that's going to address my needs. So coming out as disabled is not an easy, quick fix by any stretch of the imagination. So when we think about, again, 1 in 2 persons in the United States has an invisible disability, just think of all of the opportunities those individuals have to really craft their own lives, because they can go through these steps to know when and how and why and who we do this with. So it's important information. So I found this, and it really stirred my thoughts. I sometimes wonder if anyone does not have an invisible disability. My personal belief is that our culture has deep, hidden disabilities, and that we are causing people who have some specific differences to feel that they are disabled. Written by a young man who does have an invisible disability. So, what are our responsibilities to each other? Certainly mutual trust and respect, honoring one another and honoring each other's culture and each other's way of being in this world. To again bring forth our empathy and to empathize and educate ourselves about people and people with invisible disabilities, and to check our own wall of exclusion. What are our preconceived notions and actions around stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination? And when and how often do we catch ourselves when we have that feeling or that thought? Ask questions. Engage a person with a disability, with an invisible disability, and talk with them. Try to gain greater understanding of who that person is, the full person, not the disability, but the full person, and show us ourselves to be understanding and knowledgeable, and persons concerning invisible disabilities and people who have them. So we have some responsibilities to these individuals around disabilities and the invisibility of them and how they are in the world. So, who are people with invisible disabilities? They are us. Can you hear that? There should be sound coming out of that. Oh, it's a Dynamite song, too. Ah. You don't have.
Oh, go get the speakers.
That's all right.
I'd have to connect them if you want to try.
I'd sing it for you, but I'm sure you get up and leave right away. So, anyway, so
What song is it?
it's a toe tapping song. It's not a song, a title that I could remember, so anyway. But anyway, there you have it. So it gives you some ideas, it gives you some thoughts about a group of people that's very large in size and the invisible disabilities that they deal with every day, and in some respects, many respects, are discriminated against by lots of people. You pull up your car into the quote handicap spot, you get out, you're not using a wheelchair, you're not using an assistive device, and the people who are walking up from their parking place, eyeing you and actually walking up to you and challenging you about parking in the handicap parking place. But that's only one small glimpse into the kinds of discrimination that people with invisible disabilities confront. So.
Is there sound on your laptop?
I think what happened, there's sound on the laptop, but it's cut off with this, I think.
Do you want me to unplug it?
No.
Any questions, comments? Thank you.
Hey, that's a good question, you know, would you, when you ask that question, I mean, if I had an invisible disability, I don't think I would tell. I mean, that's how I would deal with it, and that's probably what happens, unfortunately, because of all the stigma. So, next up, I borrow the program there. Make sure. Okay. Next up, we have a call to action from our good friend and housing advocate, Supervisor Richard Elias. Thank you for joining us today out of your busy schedule. We know you're hard at work serving the constituents.
All right, appreciate that, Marco. Yes, sir. Hi, how you doing, everyone? Are we still awake?
Yes.
Of course we are. Good presentation. I like it. This mic is for your filming back here. Do I need to worry about it, or you picking me up?
You can kind of stay in the general vicinity.
Stay in the general area. That's kind of hard for me. I'll put it like this.
Thank you, sir.
All right. It's good to be back. You know, last year I thought we had a really good session as well, and it was fun. And this year again, a good lineup and important issues. Two things strike me. This morning, the Supreme Court of the United States is hearing arguments about marriage equality. Another step along this way. Another step along the issue of civil rights and where we're going and how we're going to protect each other or how we're not. Justice Ginsburg pointed out something that many people have pointed out this morning during the arguments, and she said there was a time when marriage, and part of marriage, was codified, that women became chattel to their husband. Women were owned by their husbands. Now, we all know that ain't true. We all know that's never been true.
In this country.
In this country, thank you. because this country was founded on some bold ideas about an individual and what an individual does. Nevertheless, it's codified in law. Nevertheless, it was the law of the land for many years. But what she was saying was that changed. And people in the institution of marriage didn't fall over dead. Okay? So we were, civil rights laws change. Our needs change. The reality of how we live will be defined, whether we like it or not. That's one. The other one that struck me was a couple weeks ago, I was at a demonstration at that McDonald's on Speedway, and then we moved on to campus over there at the Student Union on behalf of adjunct professors at the university and fast food workers, promoting the notion that they should earn $15 an hour. Not a civil rights issue, but Ted Warmbrand was there, and he played a really great song that I hadn't heard in a long time. And it's called Which Side Are You On? And that sometimes you kind of have to draw that line in the sand and say, which side are you on? That doesn't mean that you never cross that line, or that we're so strident or we're so perfect in our objections to things that we never deviate. Not true. But we all know deep in our hearts what side we're on. And when it comes to the issue of civil rights, we all know which side we're on. Okay? So it really crystallized those things for me. And I thought about that in preparation for today's comments, because the complexities of understanding people with hidden disabilities, the complexities of understanding how economics has changed the world and how it's changed the issue of housing, period, are real. And they're not going away anytime soon. But that doesn't change what it is that we're supposed to do. And that's all of you who live this life, who support this stuff, who continue to work towards a more fair system of housing, a more fair system of living. And that's what civil rights is really all about. That's what the Fair Housing Act of 1968 is all about. Okay? Yours is a simple task. Go out and define what's happening. Find ways to document it. Marco spoke very honestly right now about maybe not wanting to come up if he had a hidden disability. Your presentation really helped us to understand what process a person needs to go through in getting to that. Okay, so if someone's gone through all that hell, then our responsibility is to document that hell. Our responsibility is to describe that so that we have some kind of form of data, some kind of form of information about very personal stuff that's very human. So that then we can use that. We can use that. And we will use it, and we'll continue to use it. Because existing laws don't adequately express the things that need to be expressed these days. And it's very hard to institutionalize that stuff. How are we going to talk about transgender accommodations in bathrooms? Very difficult issue. How do you codify that in law? How do you put that in? Guess what? You can. You can. But it means change. It means change that follows it. And so for those of us who have to deal with policy making, you need some evidence that the stuff is happening. And that there's a group of people that are saying, wait a minute, I'm not being accommodated here, no matter what the accommodation is that they're requesting. But if you don't have some body of knowledge about it, then you can't move on it. It's just impossible to. So that becomes really difficult. lawyers. How many lawyers do we have in the room? Any practicing lawyers? Maybe that's a better question. Because the county hires a lot of lawyers that aren't practicing, I gotta tell you. And God love every one of them. They help keep the industry up on these changes. They help keep the housing industry up on all these changes so that they can stay away from regulation. That's the reality. Let's be honest. That's okay. Not that it's a cat and mouse game of any type, but we have to be real about what's happening. And that's what I said. If we're going to go out and document for people who can't entirely speak for themselves for a lot of different reasons, from our vets to whoever, then we better be able to deal with that. We better be able to recognize that the lawyers very often are employed by people on the other side to protect from that. Not necessarily in a bad way. Sometimes people want to stay on the right side of the law. I understand that. I applaud them for that. They should. But the analysis of changing laws can get really hairy. Any of you paid attention to the last 2 weeks of the state legislative session here in the state of Arizona for 2015 knows exactly what I'm talking about. Because every single bill that they passed in the last 3 weeks of the session was a strike law amendment. Which means when it got to the committee of the whole, they strike the entire bill and created a new bill and threw that in there. Despite the fact that it had already been through all these committees. Okay? So we know that there's plenty of ways to play with things and make them invisible to people so we don't see. Right? It's our system. And fortunately for us, it's worked pretty well. It has. Maybe not necessarily to my liking, right, in this session, I'll be honest. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. And it is a system that we have to face. So if we're going to be cogs in that system, then that's how we need to respond. You know, advocacy is one side of it, right? That documenting. The other side of it goes right back to what you said. We need to educate people still. So at least they have a fighting chance to be able to identify themselves, to be able to identify what's happening to them, to be able to identify what's happening to their children. Education takes a long time. Andrea, you work in the world of public health. How long has it taken us to educate people about smoking? Seems like it shouldn't be that hard to figure out. But the government really started focusing on educating people about smoking in 1977 under Joseph Califano in the Carter administration. And unfortunately, to Richard, that doesn't seem that long ago. Why are you laughing? I hate you for that. That's okay. I was already in college. I was already smoking. I already knew it was bad to smoke. What do you think, I'm stupid? None of us were. Education is a very long-term process to go through. But that's really the only thing we can do. That's what we have to do because it works. That's the great equalizer. So advocacy, education. Advocacy, education. Advocacy, education. Love, tough love. Now, on Sunday mornings, I used to like to lay around watching sports, on TV. My mother would always come around and say, "Get ready for church." Church? I'm sitting here getting ready for the big game to start. And then inevitably, she'd come back in and say, "Cállate, cabrón." And guess what? No te andes con mala cara, don't be over here with a bad face. You get happy to go to church, you understand? Education, advocacy, see? It's a two-sided coin. It's a two-sided thing, you know? We have to deal with it. And what did I do? I went to church, and I shut up, and I had a smile on my face, right? You know, because it's what you were supposed to do, right? Okay. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about just for a minute, really, because I want to keep my comments short. You know, people get scared in this kind of environment about advocating. People get scared in this kind of environment about promoting policies that don't seem to jive with what the majority want. Okay. Everybody from one political party voted against Social Security. Every single person in Congress from that party voted against Social Security. Every single one. Another day and time, every single one in one political party voted against the Affordable Health Care Act. Social Security is now a flagship program of the United States. The Affordable Health Care Act's future is still in jeopardy with the courts. Okay? We know that. When the Voting Rights Act passed, the Civil Rights Act passed in the mid-60s, huge debate. People call Barry Goldwater a great Arizonan. He was on the wrong side of that fight, wasn't he? Didn't really tarnish his reputation in later years. But he was on the wrong side of that fight. Still a great Arizona. I like to think that Cesar Chavez was the greatest Arizona. But it's okay, I'm open to argue about it, all right? I'm willing to argue about it, and I will argue about it. My point is that today, 2015, nobody wants to be opposed to civil rights. Doesn't matter what party you're in. Nobody does. You don't want to be tagged with that. Now, how that might play out in a discussion about public policy is another matter. However, for us who are advocates for civil rights, for fairness in housing, just that. Forget civil rights, fairness in housing. Just that is a notion. Nobody wants to be on the wrong side of that. I promise you that. Push that envelope. Don't be afraid to. Especially for people who can't speak up. That's why we have the document, so that we don't look foolish when we advocate for people who can't speak up for themselves. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't speak up for people who can't speak up for themselves. It's okay. We got to do it anyways. There's no option. There is no option. It's just food for thought. It's just a good time now to start putting these things on the table for all of us to question, for all of us to react to, for all politicians to have to confront in their bevy of things. Because I promise you, not many people insist on being on the wrong side of history. Now, I can think of a sheriff here in the state of Arizona who insists on being on the wrong side of history. And he even said that in court last week. And he said, essentially, I broke my oath of office because I insist on being on the wrong side of things. And yes, Judge, I investigated your wife. Now, the last time I was in a courtroom, I was there for jury duty. And the judge used to be my lawyer when I worked over in the city of South Tucson at the Housing Authority. So I made it into the jury box. The lawyers questioned me. After they finished questioning everybody, they were striking people off the list. Judge Fields says, "Oh, but juror number 7, come up here." And so I walked up there, and the judge looked at me and he said, "Richard, would you say that serving on this jury constitutes a hardship to your job? And I said, well, Judge, you know, I got a lot of things going on. And he said, Richard, would you say that serving on this jury constitutes a hardship to your job? I said, Judge, this would constitute a hardship to my job. He said, you're excused. It's like something Chris Rock would say. Listen to the judge. Do what he says. It's probably a good idea. If you don't want to get beat up on your way out the door, follow the rules, follow the laws, you know? He always has these crazy things that he comes up with. If you sneak over the subway counter and the transit police see you, they'll probably tell you to go back over and don't be stupid. But if you jump over the turnstiles carrying a gun and smoking a joint, you're probably going to get beat up. My point is, nobody wants to be on the wrong side of the judge either. So, our work is valid. Our work is real. It prevents people having to go into court because most people follow the rules. Most people don't want to stand in defiance of a judge or have his wife investigated. Isn't that surprising? That's really what it's about, guys. So the more we put out our work, the more we dictate what goes on in the discussion, the more we validate the real issues that are invisible to people, all the better for all of us at any time. At any time. So, what side are you on? The question remains. When you have doubts, look in your heart, and I'm sure you'll find the right answer. Okay? Thank you, guys.